𝗗𝗕𝗄𝗃! Moment to moment, the cells in our body require oxygen to function. Although oxygen exists in the atmosphere, the real challenge is getting it into those cells. This requires 3 specific stages. The first is to get the oxygen molecule from the atmosphere to the blood. The next is to get the oxygen-enriched blood to the area of the tissues. And the final step is to get the oxygen to move from the blood into the tissues, or in other words, into the cells. Each of these stages has a respective name. Ventilation is the term used to describe the movement of oxygen molecules from the atmosphere to the distal parts of the lungs to the tiny little sacs called alveoli, where it then crosses the 1-cell thick membrane into the blood. Circulation is the next step, which moves the oxygenated blood near the area of the hungry tissues. Finally, perfusion is the term that describes the movement of oxygen from the blood into the tissues themselves, there to be distributed to every cell. Now, to this point, we've only talked about oxygen moving toward the tissues. Indeed, tissues use oxygen as a source of energy, or food, one might say. But like all living systems that receive and consume food in all its varieties, the tissues of the body also excrete a waste product. In the case of the human body, the excretion is carbon dioxide. Therefore, the same bodily pathways needed to get oxygen to the tissues is the same pathway used, only in reverse, to move the waste product of CO2 out and away from the body. Now, with this in mind, we need to add just a bit more definition to ventilation. During inhalation, ventilation is the act of moving oxygen into the body, and exhalation is the act of moving CO2 out of our bodily systems. Now, one more term here will seal the deal. While ventilation describes what we know of colloquially as breathing, and scientifically as moving oxygen and CO2 in and out, the second stage of moving oxygen from the lungs, or the alveoli, remember those tiny little sacs at the end of the lungs that have a very thin little membrane, the term there is called respiration, and it's used to describe the movement of oxygen through the membrane into the blood and CO2 from the blood across the alveolar membranes into the lungs, and then ultimately to be exhaled into the atmosphere. So ventilation is movement of oxygen and CO2 in and out of the lungs, but respiration is moving oxygen and CO2 across the alveolar membrane in and out of the blood. Ventilation is about lungs and respiration is about blood. By the way, think about that for a moment. You move CO2 into the atmosphere, which really means you are the actual source of greenhouse gases and global warming. Want to cool the planet? Well, just stop breathing. But I kid. Our exhaled CO2, even by billions of people, is infinitesimally small and of no real consequence. So you can start breathing again. It's okay. While movement of oxygen to the distal sacs of the lungs, called the alveoli, into the blood is termed respiration, the movement of oxygen from the atmosphere to the alveoli is referred to as ventilation. The pathway starts off at the mouth and the nose, also called the oral and nasal cavity, and extends through the tree-like network of airways down into the alveoli. The entire path is termed as the conducting airways. We can further view the conducting airways as having the upper and lower part. The upper airways consist of the oral and nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. The larynx marks the point at which the lower airways are encountered, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But let's first take a closer look at the structure in the upper airway and discover their key purposes. The upper airways offer humidity and protection. As air enters the nose, it picks up heat and moisture from the nasal passages. Surfaces along all of the airways are known as the mucosa, and because the mucosa must remain warm and moist, the upper airways, most notably the nasal cavity, helps to add humidity and heat to inspired air. Additionally, the nasal cavity traps potentially harmful organisms or pathogenic or disease-causing organisms and keeps them from entering the lower respiratory tract, which can promote pulmonary infection and worse, infection throughout the whole body. Leaving the oral and nasal cavity, inspired gases reach connecting airways called the oral pharynx and the nasopharynx, and connect these areas to the general area termed as the laryngopharynx. Should pathogenic or other disease-causing organisms make their way past the nose and the mouth, they're likely to get caught on the sticky mucosal surfaces of the pharynx and the laryngopharynx. The passages we've discussed so far handle both air and food, but it is at this point that the complex receptors, sensors, and muscles innervate tissues and direct food toward the esophagus and air into the lungs.